Hello once again. So last semester, when we did any sort of materials, we really just stayed in the material properties here on the right side of the screen. And really, for the most part, I think we just stuck with the principled shader. We might have done a little bit with the glass shader or the emission shader. But really, we were just focused on what we got right here, all these sliders. We're going to take that much further this semester. And starting with working with nodes and textures to start building more complex and realistic textures. So to do that, we're going to leave this layout view, and we're going to jump over into the shading view. Now when I click on that, the screen space gets broken up, and we've got four windows here in the main area, and then we still have our outliner and properties on the right side. We have a file browser, which I don't really need right now, so I'm going to get rid of that. We also have an image viewer, which, again, I don't really need right now, so I'll get rid of that as well. And then we have our 3D viewport, which is currently in material preview mode. And we have our shading editor, which is a node editor. And I'll talk about nodes here in a second. But first, let's just kind of cover how this is set up in the 3D viewport. We have our, like I said, we have material preview, and it's using an HDRI image for lighting. And this is kind of a look development setup, a look dev setup. We can go up here on the top right, and we can click here, and we can choose any number of default HDRIs, or if you've added your own, those will show up as well. And as you do that, you can see the lighting changes. You can also affect the rotation of the background, as well as the strength of it. Put that back at 1. The opacity of it. So if you don't want to see the background, but you still want the light from the background, you can turn that opacity all the way down. And then also blur. I'll bring that opacity back up. And here's no blur. And oops, here is a lot of blur. So you can choose whichever one really works for you. I think I will just keep the opacity down to 0. We also have some shader balls here that can help with lighting and kind of seeing where your scene is. If you want those on, you can keep those on. If you want those off, you go to your viewport overlays and just turn off HDRI preview. Entirely up to you in that regard. Okay, one last thing in the 3D viewport. I know I mentioned that you can use your own HDRIs, but I didn't actually show you how to add them. What you want to do is you want to go to this little gear icon right here. It's going to bring up your preferences, and in the light section you have HDRIs, so you can just install from your file. I happen to have an HDRI, a very small HDRI library here. So let's say I want to bring in this Studio HDRI. Just click Install Custom Studio. Close that down, and now my list, see, there's my studio light, and there's that. So I'm going to jump back to go to this one for now. That's really all we need to worry about in the in the 3D view. I will also mention here, while I think of it, the shader ball that you see here is from Matthew Morell. I got this off of ArtStation. Okay, just a free download, and it's just something that can be helpful for visualizing materials, and it's a little bit more interesting to look at than a cube or a sphere. And I'll hit Control Space to unmaximize that window. All right, so let's jump down into the new thing, which is this node editor. So in the node editor, and to close my properties, by default, with a new material, this is what we have. We have these two things called nodes, and they are connected. Okay, that's showing their relationship. We have a bunch of settings, and these settings are going to look very familiar to you. So if we look at our material properties here, aside from our material slots, which I have extra slots just because the shader ball has extra things, but really we're just worried about this first one, this material. So if we ignore that, and if we ignore the preview, we start here at the surface, we're going to see parity between what we're seeing in the properties and what we're seeing in the shader editor. We have this surface area, okay, which is part of the material output. We have volume, and we have displacement, and then some additional settings as well. And then we have our surface shader, which is this principled BSDF. And you can see all the options down here are replicated below it. Okay, so we're working with the same information. There's no new new settings really here as far as the shader is concerned. But the node editor allows us to, one, see the relationship between nodes, and then also build kind of more complex relationships than we would be able to just in the surface or in the viewport properties. So what is a node, before we get into adding a bunch of nodes and connecting, and what exactly is a node? A node is it's like an operation or a equation. It's performing a specific function, and then as you link these things together, they flow into the ultimate output. Now you can use nodes for materials, as we're doing here. You can also use nodes for the world. We use this drop down here also for line style. But you can also use nodes for compositing. After you render, you can use nodes to composite. Similar to what you would do in Photoshop, obviously not with nodes, but you can perform similar functions. So there's node-based workflows all over the place, and there's other programs as well that use nodes. So we have these two nodes. Each one is performing an operation. This one is our surface shader, and so what this is doing is this is telling Blender and telling the material output. It's telling it how does light interact with the surface. What is the base color of the surface? Is the surface metallic? And if it is metallic, that means that the light that comes into it is going to, the highlights, the reflections are going to be tinted that color. Okay, so if we go blue, we can see that the highlights are now tinted blue, whereas if we pull the metallic back, we turn the roughness down so we can see this a little bit better. And let me also go with a HDRI that's going to be a little bit more on the white side of things. Okay, so now we can see that very clearly our highlights are white. If we start bringing metallic, those are going to get tinted with the base color. It's not going to completely wash it out, but it's certainly more influenced by the base color than if we don't have any metallic. So it's telling the surface of the material how light interacts with it in all these different ways. Now you can also have a volume shader to tell the material how light interacts with the volume of the material, the kind of the inside, great for smoke and particles and things like that. And we have displacement, which is how the actual geometry moves, and we'll come to displacement at a later date. The other very obvious thing that you'll notice about nodes is we have these dots on the left and the right side. So what these dots are, they're referred to as sockets. Also inputs and outputs, and what they are connection points for the information. So right now, you can see we've got a ton of sockets on the left side, and those are all inputs. In the node editors, information flows from left to right, as long as you have them, if you do this, then it's going the opposite way, but don't do that because that's confusing. Stick with the left to right configuration, and we have information flowing in to the left and out the right. Okay, so we have, for instance, we can add in, with Shift A, we can add in an input and RGB value. I can pull the color into the space color, and now I can define it here, and you can see it reflected in my viewport. Okay, so we have the output of our color is flowing into the input of our base color on our surface shader, and then the output of the surface shader is flowing into the surface of the material output. Okay, you'll also notice that there are different colors for each of these sockets, and those colors do have a specific meaning, and that can give you a clue as to what sort of information Blender is looking for each of these values. The first one I'll start with is actually the gray. You see most of these in this shader are gray. And what that means is it's looking for what is officially referred to as a float value, but it's just a single numeric value. And so, for instance, the metallic value here is looking for a value between 0 and 1. So if you want to plug an input into that, what you can do is use just a value input and plug that into metallic. And now we set the value here. Again, we just have a single number. We'll say 0.5. And now that is driving it. Now, in this very simple case, why would you have a value input when you can just enter it here? The answer is you don't need one. But let's say you wanted the metallic value to be the same as the anisotropic value, so that the more metallic it got, the more that anisotropy went up. Now, I should mention a couple things here. One, the material preview doesn't always show every effect that you make, or every change that you make, in part because the material preview is using the EV render engine, whereas Cycles has a few more options. And since we're using Cycles, sometimes you might need to jump into the rendered view to see the effect. When you do that, I also need to go up here to my viewport shading and turn off scene world and scene lights. And we'll see that a little bit more. Okay. Let's bring some roughness up here, and now we can see our anisotropy. See that distortion? So now you can see this value is driving both the metallic and the anisotropic reflections. Okay, so that's one case where you may or may not want to do that. So that's what the gray sockets mean. The yellow sockets, which we've already seen up here, are color information. Sometimes it's color, but it's also RGB, so it's like 3 values as well. So if we go to RGB, we've got 0.5, 0.055, and 0.085. So those 3 values are what are going into that. And we can see that if we go and we add in a, let's see, I believe it's a converter, and separate RGB. We can bring this color and separate it, and then we've got a red value, we've got a green value, we've got a blue value. Okay, they're all different intensities, right? Because this red value, for instance, you can see it's a gray output. So that means it's just taking a single number. So if we go over here and look at our red value of 0.5, it's putting out a gray value of 0.5. If we go up to 1, that's going to be white, because it's got a value of 1. It's like dragging this all the way up. And if we go to 0, it's going to be black. So that brings us to another important thing, or important concept to understand when we're dealing with these float values, these just gray numeric values. And that is, black is a value of 0, and white is a value of 1. Okay? So let's take a look at that again. Down here in the, we'll stick with the metallic, why not? Okay, so we're plugging a color into metallic, but the color is 3 values, and metallic only wants a gray value. It just wants a single number. So what it's doing is it's basically in the background, it's combining, it's averaging all these numbers, and just plugging that in. But if we just bring this to white, we'll bring the saturation all the way down. Okay, so now all the numbers are the same. So now as I go black to white, we can see they're all changing the same. And now we can see that if we go all the way to the black, there is no metallic reflections here. If we go all the way to white, it's completely metallic. So this is going to be an important concept that we're going to use all over the place. So there's gray and yellow sockets. We also have blue sockets, which are normal values or vector values. If we're using a normal map, we're going to plug that into a blue socket. And then as far as what we have right now, we also have these green sockets, and these are for shaders. Okay. Now, we can also add a whole lot more nodes. And before I do that, I know I added a couple already. We're going to delete those for now. Before I do that, I want to enable one add-on. So I'm going to go to Edit Preferences, go to my add-ons, and just make sure that I have Nodewrangler enabled. It's packaged with Blender by default. So just search for Node, it'll pop up. Just check the box and it'll automatically and immediately be activated. You can also expand this down and go to the documentation and kind of see everything that it does. It's got some lovely features that will help with connecting sockets and adding a bunch of shortcuts for common actions in the node editor. For the most part, we're not going to be worrying too much about this, especially today. But it does do one thing that allows us to quickly preview what's going on. And so that's why I have it enabled for now. I will call it out again in the future as we use it more and more. Okay, so we have that. Now let's start adding some nodes. So right now, like I said, we just have our shader and we have the material output. So we're using this principled shader and we're saying that this is going to control the surface. By the way, I've neglected to mention this earlier. To navigate around the node editor, it's the same as you would in the 3D viewport. You can middle click and drag to pan, and you can use the scroll wheel to zoom, or control middle click and drag to zoom in if you want. Obviously you can't rotate around because this is a 2D space. There's no 3D node editor. That would potentially be confusing, although maybe cool. Okay, so let's add a couple of nodes and start building on this complexity just a little bit. So we have a node, we have an add menu right here. And here, as we slowly scroll through all of these, we can see all of the options that we have. And it's a lot. I know that. But it'll start to make sense as you start to work with them. They are categorized, and you won't use all of them all the time, and some of you might never use. Like we will never use anything in the script category. Well, the script. We won't use a script node. But we'll use probably 10 to 20 of them throughout the course of this. You'll start to get pretty comfortable with it. If you can't remember where a node is, you can always search for it. You can also hit Shift A, and that'll bring up your add menu wherever your cursor is, which is the way that I will do this because it's faster. And so let's start with, we'll add another input here. Input RGB, so we're going to add another color. And I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate that. Okay, just like we would an object in the 3D space. And then let's say I want to take these two colors. We'll go with maybe like a brighter teal. And we'll go with a fuchsia. Okay. Now let's say I want to combine these two. Well, for that, Shift A, we can add in a color, mix RGB. We get this mix node. You'll also start to notice that each of these nodes is color coded by the category that it's in. So shaders are green, which nicely ties in with the fact that the green sockets are for shaders. You have inputs are red. We have, in this case, it's these color nodes are yellow. But I'm going to drag the first color into the color 1 slot, the second color into the color 2 slot. Okay, and then we will drag the color output into the base color. And this is what we get. We get this kind of almost lilac color. And so what's happening here? What it's doing is it's taking these two colors and it's just mixing them together. Just blending them 50%. So it's taking the red values and it's averaging the red values. Same thing with the blue values and same thing with the green values. And it's doing it evenly with a factor of 0.5. So that means it's 50% mix. If I bring this factor all the way to the left, we're going to get the first color, whatever's in the first socket. If I bring this all the way to the right, it's going to give me the second color. And then I can choose any amount in between. I also have a mix menu, And so you'll see all these different blending modes that you would also see in, for instance, Photoshop. So we have overlay, we have soft light, we have screen and darken and multiply, everything that you're used to. Now with these solid colors, you're not going to see a huge difference, but we have all those options. And we have this clamp value, and what this clamp value is going to do is keep the results in the 0 to 1 range. And what that means is when we're using physically based rendering, you can't have more light output than you have in. Okay, so you can't take, let's say we have two inputs and they both have a value of 1. We can't, if we add it, it's going to be brighter than it was with the inputs. Okay, because 1 plus 1 is 2, right? That makes sense. But if this is a value of 1 and this is a value of 1, it's going to give us an output of a value of 2. And the clamp value basically stops that from happening. Because that would not be physically realistic. And we'll talk more about this as we start building shaders for real. This is more of an overview of how the shader editor works. So we're also not going to use add very often. We're going to stick with mix for now. Okay, so those are our options. And we've got inputs plugged into both the color sockets, but we can also plug something into the factor. And yes, we could plug in another value, but we can also, this is where things get really interesting, is we can plug in a texture. So I'm going to just choose a checker texture here. And this is a procedurally generated texture. And we can see this. This is why I turned on Nodewrangler. If you Control-Shift-Click on the node, it's going to automatically set up a little viewer node, and we can see exactly what the output of that node is. So it'll first go into the first socket, which in this case is color. So it's using the colors that this is providing. If we Control-Shift-Click on it again, then we get this factor. Okay. Now I'm also going to turn on a cube right here so we can kind of see it on a more even surface. Okay, so this is the texture. And what we can do is we can plug this texture. I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on the shader so it's going to link that back up. But we can plug this, take the factor of the texture and plug it into the factor of the mix node. And this is what we get. Okay, and we can still control this checker texture. We can adjust the shade, or excuse me, the scale. That's what that word is. Okay, and you can see how that affects how these are mixed. Now this checker texture does also have color attributes, so you could just use this checker texture. You don't need the RGBs and the mix, but I just want to demonstrate a type of setup that you would have, where you have two inputs, and then you have something controlling how they mix together, which in this case is a checker texture, but you could use any texture. All right. Textures are great because they allow you to mix two things together and not have it uniform. If we don't have that texture, they're just going to get mixed together in a uniform way. But this allows us to control it on almost a pixel by pixel basis. Okay. Now, yeah, as I was saying, in this particular instance with a checker texture, you could just plug the color into the base color, and then we can drag this color into the first color slot, and we can drag this color into the second color slot, and we get the same effect. You see these three nodes are no longer connected, and it's just this checker texture driving it. Okay, so in this case, we don't need all this extra setup, but if we just want to use the factor, then this is what we get. And we can also Control-Shift-Click on the mix node if we want to see it without any shading, just exactly what you get. And we can go back to our material preview. We don't need to be doing a cycles render in the background and further taxing our system. Okay. All right, so excuse these, when I pause the recording, the Nodewrangler shortcuts kick in and they add these additional nodes, which I don't need. So I'm going to hit Control-X, and it's going to delete them, but also keep the links. Okay. So we have So right now we have a texture that is controlling the mix here. But we can also use a texture to control values directly. So I'm going to, just for now, I'm going to disconnect this. And I'll disconnect the factor as well. We'll just move these off to the side. I'm just going to focus on the checker texture. Now again, if we remember, if we just look at the factor, so Control-Shift-Click on it a couple times, the factor is just, this is a black and white pattern. So these colors, you can basically control what color the actual pattern is. But the pattern itself is just a black and white pattern. And you know what, just to make it a little bit easier to understand and hopefully less confusing, I'll just turn these to black and white. Okay. So now it doesn't really matter which one we're looking at, it's going to look the same. But we have this texture, and we can use this, for instance, in a metallic slot. Now, as I said before, white is a value of 1 and black is a value of 0. So, when we look at how this applies to our shader, we can see that anywhere that has a value of 0 is not metallic at all. Right? So if we look at the checker texture, we can see that this square right here is black and this one is white. So if we go back to our principled shader, again with Shift-Control-Click on it, we can see that this is not at all metallic and this is metallic. And the same thing can be carried through towards any of these values that have inputs. So we can have this control the roughness. Okay, what parts are glossier than others? We can have this control the transmission if we wanted to, which this isn't necessarily a great example for it. Okay, you can kind of start to see through it here. We can also have it control the emission, which is a fun thing to do. Now this is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to bring the scale down, and let's add in a plane in the viewport. Let's have an edit mode and scale it up. Where's my plane? There it is. S20, and let's move it over. And I'm just going to give this a temporary material because we're going to delete this here shortly, but just something so that we can see the effect of our emission. Go back to our rendered view, and I will turn off the scene world in the rendered view, and now we can see the emission controlling the lighting, which I think is super cool. Emission just looks nice in general. Okay. So, very cool things that we can do with textures just in and of themselves. And I'm using a checker texture, but you can also use, if I select this node, I can hit Shift-S, and that'll allow me to switch the node to something else. So I can switch that to a noise texture, which is another texture I use frequently. Okay. And so, in this case, it's showing me emission, and our base color is still blue. But we can adjust this noise texture, we can adjust the scale, all sorts of things like that. Now we can also, I'll go back to, let's say, the base color here. Actually, here's what I'll do. I'm going to get rid of, or I won't get rid of, I'm going to move this over, and we're going to plug the noise texture factor into the mix node. So there we go. And we'll turn our scene world back off, so we're using the HDRI again, and we'll go back to our material preview. Okay. So we've got our textures, but we can do more with textures. We can modify them. So I'm going to make a little bit of space between this. Actually, I'll make the space here. And I'm going to hit Shift-A, and we have, in our color options, we've got brightness contrast, we have hue saturation, invert. I'm just going to start with a brightness contrast, really simple node. Now with nodes, one nice thing that you can do with them is if you want to add a node between these two, you can see as I hover over each of these connecting lines, they highlight. So if I hover over this line and click, it's going to automatically connect it in between the two. It saves you a little bit of time. So with this node, as much as you would expect for any other image manipulation application like Photoshop, the brightness will adjust the brightness of the noise texture. And we can shift click on this node to specifically preview this output. So I'm going to hold down shift so I have a finer tuned control over this, but you can see how brightness affects it. Here's how contrast affects it. If we do that, and then we can shift control click on the shader, that's what we get. I'm going to delete this again, so control X, it's going to delete that and keep the connection. If I undo that and just hit X, you can see that it removes that connection. Okay. So we have hue saturation, which works the same way. If we want to shift the hues here, although with factor we're not really going to notice that, so we can leave that at 0.5 or whatever, it doesn't really matter. We can adjust the value, which is also kind of like brightness, so undo that. I'll control X and delete that. We can add in a converter and color ramp. Okay, and I'm going to shift control click on that so we can see the results of this directly. What this allows us to do is to map new colors and also kind of adjust the levels, like we're using a levels adjustment layer in Photoshop. So I can drag up the black value, and that's going to have more influence. I can drag down the white value, and this is like increasing the contrast. I can change the interpolation to something like B-spline, which is going to be a little bit smoother. I can also plug in more nodes. If I hit this plus, now I've got another node. And so if I want this to be gray, I can say I want a lot of blacks in there, and then I want a fair amount of mid-grays, and then just a little bit of bright white at the end. Okay, so you've got a ton of control with it that way. And then we can check the output and see how that looks. Okay, then we can get rid of those as well. Okay, so we have all these options, and that's all fine and wonderful. But how do we tell Blender how to apply these textures to our materials or to our objects? Right? How do we tell it that we want, which way the texture should be oriented? Now, in this case, with a noise texture, it doesn't really matter because it's kind of an abstract texture anyway. But let's say I'll just delete all of these nodes, and I'm going to add in an image texture. To do that, I can either hit Shift A, add texture, image texture, okay, or I can, in my Explorer or Finder if you're on Mac, just drag in an image directly into the node editor. And that will give me the same node, and I'm going to connect that color to the base color. And there we go. So now we can start to see how we can get some more realistic looking materials. And I'll focus here more on the shader ball. So we've got a few options with our image texture. We have the interpolation, we have kind of the mapping, we have if we want that texture to repeat, and we have single image, because we can also apply an image sequence, a movie, generated, or UDIM tiles. Stick with single image, and then we have color space. So for any color textures, we're going to stick with sRGB. If we're using an image texture for something that isn't a color, then what we're going to want to do is change the color space to non-color. And I'll talk about that more when that becomes more immediately relevant. I just want to start planting that seed because that's an important thing to remember. Okay, so we have our image texture. Now how do we tell it where we want it to be? By default, Blender seems to have a pretty good idea, at least with this cube. And I can turn on a plane and a sphere. I'm going to delete this plane. And I have a Suzanne as well. And you can see that by default, Blender seems to have a pretty good idea of how all of this stuff works. And that's just because, I'll right-click and shade smooth. That's just because these are default primitives. And you can see up here we've got some texture distortion. And this is what happens. This is the sort of thing that happens when you don't have your textures mapped well, is you get this distortion. And this is what we're trying to avoid in all of our texture mapping decisions. So as we're saying, Blender has a pretty good idea of how this works by default, or with default objects. But as soon as you start changing and manipulating objects, so let's say I take this face and I inset it, something like that, and then I extrude it up. Okay, now already, Blender's like, what the hell are you doing? I don't understand. And this is where we need to start being able to control how this works. So, one option that you have, and this sticks with kind of a procedural option, is we can change this flat mapping to a box mapping. Let's see. I think we want to go with... but you can see that this isn't working immediately, and that's because we need to tell Blender exactly how to adjust this mapping. So, what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 more nodes. And that's going to be a input texture coordinates. I'll get rid of our RGB nodes. We don't need them anymore. Try to zoom in so you can see this clearly. We have our texture coordinates, and then we also want to add in a vector mapping node. We'll talk about what each of these do. So, as I said, the blue is for vector or normal information. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, for now, connect generated to vector, and then the output of the mapping into the input of our image texture. And that's going to tell Blender to use generated texture coordinates and map those on our image or to our image. So, by default, this is set to flat, and when we do that, we get our same weird distortion. But if we change this to a box mapping, well, now, basically what it's doing is it's taking that image and it's projecting it from all sides of a box, all 6 sides of the box, top to bottom, the front and the back, the left and the right. Okay, and it looks really great on a simple cube. That's awesome. Let's see how it looks on a sphere. And for this, let me first turn off that. And we'll bring this down a little bit. It looks okay from a distance, but as we get up close, we can see... Let me turn the blend value off. Okay, we can see these hard seams. And since I've already given this away, we have this blend value, which we can use to help disguise those edges and those seams. And this works sometimes better than others. It depends on what texture you're using and what the shape of your object is. But we have that option. Okay? And that's using this generated texture coordinates. Now we have other texture coordinates that we can use. We have normal texture coordinates. We have UV texture coordinates, okay, which aren't going to look great right now because the UVs are terrible for the most part. Let me also turn this back to flat. Okay, so the that makes everything look a lot better. Primitives have default UVs, and I'll talk about UVs in the next video. But for now, you can kind of think of UVs as like reverse origami. It's taking the mesh and laying it out flat so it knows how to put a 2D texture on it. So these primitives have pretty good UVs. When you start modifying the primitives, then you get some issues. And then in this case, this object came with UVs. So it looks good there. We can also set it to object, We can set it to camera, which is based on just the camera's perspective, so you can see as we orbit the camera around, the texture doesn't really change, which is kind of a disorienting thing, but also kind of cool. We have window, which it maps the texture to the window space, the screen space. So you see the texture doesn't move at all. And then we have reflection, which will only map the texture to the reflection, which is a pretty cool thing. And as we're working with this, I'm going to go to UV. We have this mapping node. And this mapping node allows us to adjust the location, the rotation, and the scale of the texture. Okay, so like when we had the checker texture or the noise texture, we had a scale value. Well, this mapping node allows us to do the same thing, but also some more with location and rotation. So as we kind of see all of our objects here, I can adjust the location. I'll hold down Shift so you can see this a little bit better. So you can kind of fine-tune exactly where you want things to end up. We have rotation works the same. We can do maybe Z rotation. You can see that sort of thing. These values are animatable, by the way, which is just a cool thing. You know, you can hover over anything and hit I. We're not going to do any texture animation, at least not anytime in the near future, but I wanted to mention it while I thought of it. And then lastly, we have scale. Now, scale you kind of need to be careful about, because if you don't scale evenly, like if you just scale in one direction, you're going to get this really stretched look, which we don't generally want. Whoops, actually we want that at 1. So to scale all of these at once, you can left click on one and drag to select all three. You can see how they get darker as we drag down. And then we can drag left and right, and you can see it adjusts the scale all at once. And I'll hold down Shift again to make smaller adjustments. Okay. So that's how we can kind of control these textures. Now, we will get into building materials and shaders with multiple image textures to get a more realistic result in a couple of videos, but we have one important step to go through before we get there, and that is UV unwrapping, something that we can't really avoid, unfortunately, and our scene is going to offer us lots of opportunity to do that. So that will be the next video, but in the meantime, here's a quick preview of what UV unwrapping looks like. Okay, again, it's taking this 2D texture and taking a 3D object, unfolding it into a plane, and then applying a texture to it. Now, I will mention, first I'll bring up our image editor so you can see what the actual image is that I'm using. So here's our 2D image. When you're actually doing this for real, you don't have two separate objects here. It's all the same object. But I just wanted to kind of demonstrate for you what this looks like. Okay, you can see our cube is laid out flat, and this is kind of what we get. So that's coming up in the next few videos.